father cared for his paralyzed daughter for 25 years. One day, after noticing something strange, he placed cameras in his home, but what was discovered left him with goosebumps. Stephen woke up suddenly to the sound of his alarm clock. As he sat up in bed, he felt his bones crack, a reminder that he was already 65 years old. Despite his age, he didn't let that discourage him. After getting ready and washing her face, she went into the next room to wake up her daughter, Helen, who was now 35 years old. Helen hasn't been able to move her legs since she had a serious accident at age 10. Since that day, Stephen dedicated himself to taking care of her with great affection. He walked over and, with a gentle touch, began to gently shake her shoulder. "Helen, honey, it's time to wake up," Stephen said in a soft voice. She grumbled a little and slowly opened her eyes. On Helen's face, there was a childlike expression, as if she was still only 10 years old. The scene brought a smile to Stephen's face, reminding him how much he loved his daughter and how much her presence brightened his days. Stephen helped Helen into her wheelchair, which was next to the bed. Carefully, he led her to the bathroom and, after helping her clean and dress, the two went to the kitchen to have breakfast together. Over the years, Stephen had created a careful routine for caring for his daughter. He knew exactly how to move her without hurting her and how to feed her calmly, using a spoon to feed her food. While serving breakfast, Stephen noticed something different in Helen's eyes. There was a sparkle in her eyes, as if she wanted to smile. Suddenly, he saw Helen's toes moving slightly under the table. It was a subtle movement, but Stephen was sure of what he had seen. After breakfast, Stephen took Helen outside where she could get some morning sun. This was part of their daily routine. They loved walking through the garden and breathing in the fresh air. However, that day, Stephen was especially alert for any strange signs. And soon he saw the fingers of Helen's hand moving slightly, in addition to noticing an almost imperceptible change in the way she sat. At night, after putting Helen to bed, Stephen lay awake, deep in thought. He began to wonder if it was possible that Helen wasn't actually paralyzed. Has she been faking this whole time? Stephen scolded himself for thinking like that, but doubt had already crept into his mind. The next morning, he woke up early, as he did every day, feeling the weight of his 65 years and the common pain of that age. However, the physical pain was insignificant compared to the sadness he carried inside. He had only lived with Helen since a car accident took the lives of his wife and other daughter. Since then, Stephen dedicated himself fully to caring for Helen, who had suffered serious injuries and could no longer move her legs. The doctors carried out several tests and were clear: Helen would never walk again. Stephen firmly believed what the doctor said, but something in his heart made him feel alert, as if something was out of place. That morning, Stephen went to Helen's room, prepared for another day of care. However, he felt that this day would be different. Knowing his daughter well, he was able to interpret her every look and gesture. So, when he noticed an unusual sparkle in Helen's eyes and a subtle movement in her toes, butterflies in his stomach alerted him that something important was happening. Stephen felt the cold tile floor beneath his feet as he went to the bathroom for his morning wash. Moving slowly, he felt the weight of the years. Then he went to Helen's room, prepared to wake her and begin the long process of getting her up, bathing her, and dressing her, a routine he had followed for many years. "Good morning, Helen," Stephen said, trying to sound happy as he opened the curtains to let in the light. Helen grumbled, shielding her eyes from the glare. Her hair was messy, and the room smelled bad from the dirty sheets. Stephen sighed, placing Helen in her wheelchair and taking her to the bathroom. Carefully, he took off her clothes, avoiding looking too much at his daughter's injured body, and placed her in the shower. Helen moaned as the hot water touched her skin. "Don't cry, we're already done," Stephen reassured her. After rinsing her, he combed her hair gently, the result of years of practice. Helen looked distant, muttering words that Stephen couldn't understand. As soon as he finished caring for her, he placed her back in the chair and took her to the kitchen, where he fed her carefully, cleaning her mouth when necessary. It was a routine done with love, but doubts were growing inside him. After leaving Helen watching TV in the living room, Stephen went to his bedroom and took out some old boxes full of photos, newspaper clippings, and articles about the accident that happened 25 years ago. He wanted to find something that could confirm or alleviate his suspicions. Upon seeing the photos of his deceased wife and daughter, a wave of sadness. Among the memorabilia, Stephen found the newspaper clipping about the accident, a car crashing into a truck, with his wife at the wheel and Helen in the back seat. Helen survived, but was paralyzed. Reliving the pain of those moments in the hospital and Helen's tears, Stephen questioned why he doubted now, after so long. Maybe it's just tiredness, he thought as he put everything away. Then he went to lunch with Helen, feeding her as he always did. Then, he put her to bed to rest and decided to lie down too, feeling a severe headache. After a nap that lasted until the afternoon, Stephen went to Helen's room and was startled when he didn't find her there. The wheelchair was also gone. Breathless, he ran through the house, calling out to her. Finally, he found Helen in the yard, sitting and looking at the plants. "Helen, what are you doing here?" Stephen asked nervously. Helen was startled by the question, looking at him confused and trying to say something that didn't make sense. Stephen noticed that Helen didn't seem worried about being out of bed. After calming down, Stephen took Helen inside without saying anything and placed her in front of the TV, where she stayed for the rest of the day. However, he spent the night awake, tormented by what had happened. "I couldn't stop wondering if Helen had really been faking her condition all this time. How could I get this doubt out of my head?" The next morning, Stephen decided to take action. He left Helen in the care of a nurse who came to help them a few times a week and went out shopping. He bought small hidden cameras that he could place around the house to watch Helen while she wasn't around. Although he felt bad about distrusting his daughter, he knew he needed to know the truth.
At night, with Helen already asleep, he installed the cameras in discrete locations, pointing to the main rooms of the house. He connected everything to a tablet in his room, so he could see everything without Helen noticing. Stephen went to sleep anxiously, eager to find out what he wanted to know so much. The next morning, he woke up even more anxious and went straight to check the tablet. He quickly looked at the recordings from the night and saw nothing strange. Helen was motionless on the bed, as always. Relief washed over Stephen, who began to think that maybe he was being paranoid. After breakfast, he went to wake Helen, who was lying down looking at the ceiling. "Good morning, Helen, time to get up," Stephen said, opening the curtains. Helen blinked, confused by the light, and mumbled a few words. Stephen helped her into the wheelchair and took her to the bathroom to wash up. As he bathed and dressed Helen, he saw nothing different. She seemed as passive and distant as ever. After the shower, Stephen took Helen to the kitchen, gave her breakfast and, after cleaning her mouth, placed her in front of the television. Feeling a little foolish for distrusting his own daughter, he went back to his room to check the cameras. To his surprise, the recordings showed something unbelievable. As soon as Stephen left, Helen stopped muttering. His face changed, revealing a clear and conscious expression. She managed to get up, with effort, and walked to the bathroom. There, he touched his face and hair in the mirror, as if he were evaluating himself. Then, before returning to the chair, he resumed his distant expression, just in time for Stephen to return. Stephen was shocked and confused. His suspicions were real. Helen had been deceiving him all this time. But why? How long had this been happening? Did Helen fake her paralysis since the accident or did it start later? He was filled with a mixture of anger, confusion, and sadness. He thought about lighting a cigarette to calm down, even though he had stopped smoking years ago. However, he knew he needed more proof before confronting Helen. He spent the day watching the tablet, watching Helen do things she shouldn't be able to do, stretch her legs, stand near the refrigerator and lean on the furniture to walk. Stephen couldn't believe he had spent 25 years caring for Helen, thinking she couldn't walk when in fact she could. He felt deeply deceived and began to wonder if Helen had been laughing at him all this time. That night, after putting Helen to bed, he lay awake, restless, pondering what to do. Part of him wanted to confront Helen immediately and ask for an explanation, but his reason advised him to be cautious and gather more evidence before any confrontation. He even considered speaking to a lawyer the next morning.
Before I continue, I need to tell you something. Do you want to attract a lot of money into your life? Check out the powerful and secret Tesla ritual that I will leave in the first pinned comment, and start transforming your financial life. Let's continue.
As dawn broke, Stephen's anger subsided, giving way to sadness. He wondered how things had gotten to this point. How had her daughter changed so much to keep such a huge lie for so long? He remembered Helen as small, smiling and full of energy. What had made that innocent girl turn into the woman who lied? Determined to change his approach, Stephen decided, instead of looking for more lies, to try to understand what led Helen to fake her condition. That day, he treated her with more affection, trying to see beyond her false incapacity. During lunch, he tried to talk to Helen, asking how she was feeling and if she needed anything. Helen just murmured, making no sense, but Stephen thought he saw sadness in her eyes. After lunch, instead of sitting her in front of the TV, Stephen took Helen outside where they could get some sun together. He told stories of when Helen was a child, of the games they played and her contagious laugh. He talked about her mother and how much he loved her. Helen said nothing, but a tear ran down her face. At night, Stephen carefully put Helen to bed, covering her gently, and turned off the light. He left the tablet on, but he was no longer interested in the recordings. What he really wanted was to reconnect with Helen. Over the next few days, Stephen devoted more time to spending time with Helen. He took her for a walk in the park, read children's stories and showed her old photos. He noticed that Helen seemed more present and active. One day, while flipping through a photo album, Helen touched a picture of the two of them and murmured, "Mommy, Daddy." Stephen was thrilled. It was the first time Helen had said anything coherent in years. With tears in his eyes, he hugged her and said, "I love you." At that moment, Stephen realized that the most important thing was not to expose the lie, but to rebuild his relationship with his daughter. In time, he was sure that Helen would open up and tell the truth about her supposed paralysis. But for now, he just wanted to enjoy his daughter's company, enjoying the small victories that were revealing themselves every day. For the first time in years, Stephen felt hope. The weeks passed and the connection between him and Helen grew, slowly but steadily. Helen was becoming increasingly communicative and expressive in her father's presence, and even began to speak a few words again. Stephen decided to stop checking hidden camera recordings, thinking it wasn't right to spy on Helen. He wanted to rebuild trust between them, so he started interacting more directly, without the need for cameras. One morning after breakfast, Stephen took Helen out into the backyard to enjoy the spring sunshine. The sky was clear and the birds were singing. "What a beautiful day, isn't it, daughter?" Steve said. Helen opened her eyes and murmured something he didn't understand. He knew that her recovery would take time and that he needed to be patient. When they went back inside, past the mirror, Helen looked at her reflection and seemed more attentive. "You look great, Helen," Stephen said, trying to cheer her up. He mentioned how her hair was still wild, like it was when she was a child. Helen looked at him and gave a small smile, touching Stephen. After lunch, as Stephen took Helen to his room to rest, she held his arm and said, "Daddy," in a weak voice. Stephen was very emotional, as it had been years since she called him that. "What happened, daughter?" Stephen asked, worried. Helen pointed to the window, wanting to go back to the garden. He took her to the rose gardens and told her to call him if she needed anything. Before going to hang the clothes on the line, Stephen suddenly heard a noise coming from the backyard and ran, fearing that Helen had fallen. But what he saw surprised him. Helen was standing, leaning against the wall, with her wheelchair lying beside her. It looked like she had tried to walk and tripped. Upon seeing Stephen, Helen was scared. "Daughter, can you walk?" Stephen asked in disbelief. Helen did not respond, his legs were shaking from the effort of standing. She fell to the floor, and Stephen rushed to help her, making her sit up. Helen avoided looking into his eyes, and her lip trembled. "Don't worry, I'm not mad," Stephen reassured her. "But I need you to explain to me what's going on." Helen shook her head, refusing to look at him. "Please, Helen, I know you've been lying to me about your paralysis all these years. I need to understand why." Then Helen started crying, and Stephen comforted her, hugging her like he did when she was younger. After calming down, Helen apologized and began to tell her story. He said that after the accident that killed his mother, he woke up in the hospital unable to move. Doctors said she might get better, but months passed without progress. Helen became depressed about being so limited and hated how sorry the other children felt for her. One day, he discovered that he could move his toes and, in secret, he began to train his legs until he could stand and walk a little. But being a paraplegic had already become part of who she was, bringing her attention and avoiding school and socializing. Even after being discharged, Helen continued to fake her disability. The lie started as something temporary, but it became permanent. She felt guilty for deceiving Stephen, but was afraid to tell the truth. Stephen heard everything shocked. When Helen finished, he said that she should have told her sooner, but that the important thing was that he now knew the truth and that he would help her. Helen cried with relief and hugged him tightly. Stephen consoled her, promising that they would overcome this situation together. That night, after dinner, they talked more. Stephen reaffirmed his love and understanding, without resentment. Helen shared more about her fears and frustrations, and Stephen promised to make an appointment with a psychologist and physiotherapist to help Helen regain strength and stability in her legs. The next day, Stephen scheduled an appointment with Dr. Anna, a renowned psychologist, for the afternoon, and scheduled physical therapy sessions 3 times a week with a therapist specializing in rehabilitation. Helen seemed nervous when informed about the appointments, but agreed to go. After coffee, Stephen and Helen talked. He said he understood her fear in the face of this big change, but reinforced that it was essential to be strong and dedicated to overcome the lies and limitations that Helen had created for herself. Telling the truth was the hardest step, but Stephen comforted Helen, saying, "Now I'm here to support you through everything. You're not alone." Helen, moved, thanked him and expressed her desire to change. "I want to try. I can't stand living in hiding anymore," she said. It was a defining moment for Helen, going out for the first time without having to pretend. With his hands shaking with anxiety and emotion, Stephen reassured her and helped her get into the car, ensuring that Dr. Margaret was very understanding. On the way, Helen observed the world outside, enchanted by everything, as if it were a new discovery. Arriving at the appointment, they were greeted by Dr. Margaret, who made them feel at home. She had a kind and welcoming air. "Nice to meet you, Helen," he said, "here you can feel safe to talk." Helen sat down, still shy, but the psychologist's smile made her feel more at ease. Dr. Margaret explained that the space was safe and non-judgmental, a place where Helen could share her feelings openly. "Here we can talk about anything you're feeling, okay?" Dr. Margaret asked, and Helen, feeling more comfortable, agreed. During the nearly 2-hour-long session, Helen shared her feelings of shame, fear and insecurity, explaining how these feelings led her to fake her disability and how this created a cycle that was difficult to break. The psychologist listened carefully, asking relevant questions and emphasizing that, despite mistakes, it was essential not to criticize oneself too much. "Now is the time to heal and rediscover yourself," she said. Stephen also participated, receiving guidance on how to support Helen without putting too much pressure on her. He promised his unconditional support. In the end, Dr. Margaret praised their progress for opening up and scheduled weekly appointments. Helen felt renewed. "After that conversation, it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be," Stephen said on the way home. Helen agreed, feeling hopeful for the first time in a long time. After lunch, they went to their first physiotherapy session with Lucas. The office had various equipment to help exercise each part of the body. Lucas, the physiotherapist, was a strong and energetic man, but very friendly. He gave Helen a thorough exam, noting muscle atrophy from lack of use, but nothing that couldn't be improved with training. They started with light stretching and strengthening exercises. Helen got tired quickly, but Lucas was patient, teaching exercises to do at home too. Stephen watched, proud of Helen's effort. At the end of the session, Lucas suggested increasing protein intake to help with muscle development. Helen was tired but motivated. Returning home, she was excited, telling her father about the exercises. "The therapist said I'll soon be able to stand without shaking and maybe even start walking a little," he said, and Stephen was very happy to see his daughter so motivated. They knew the journey would be long, but they were on the right path. That night, Helen slept early, exhausted. Stephen called Mrs. Rosalia, a nurse he had helped in the past, to say that they would no longer need her services. She was surprised by the news, but accepted the decision. For Stephen, it was time for Helen to become more independent, leaving another part of the past behind. Over the next few days, Helen showed progress, being able to stand and take a few steps. The psychologist also noticed improvements in Helen's mood and self-esteem. However, there were moments of frustration. After a challenging physiotherapy session, Helen returned home irritated and locked herself in her room. The next day, a worried Stephen found Helen's room empty. After looking everywhere for her, he called the police. The search began, and Stephen spent the night anxiously. Fortunately, Helen was found disoriented but safe near a square. When they met again, she apologized for running away. Stephen hugged her, relieved. "Don't worry, we'll solve everything together," he said. Stephen realized he needed to help Helen gain more confidence and autonomy. He took her to public places to help her get used to the outside environment and deal with her anxiety. Little by little, Helen began to feel more comfortable in the presence of other people and to manage her emotions better. Dr. Margaret helped Helen see that relapsing is part of recovery and promised to always support her, which gave Helen a lot of reassurance. Over time, Helen adapted to her new situation. Stephen bought a smaller wheelchair to make his outdoor trips easier, which helped a lot with Helen's recovery. The advances in physical therapy under Lucas were impressive. Helen was now able to stand and walk with the walker. Seeing the progress, Lucas suggested to Stephen that Helen try walking alone. Stephen, excited, shared the idea with Helen, who, despite being nervous, accepted the challenge. In the living room, with room to walk, Stephen held Helen's hands, encouraging her. Helen, taking a deep breath, took her first steps with her father's help. Little by little, she gained confidence until she let go of Stephen's hands and walked alone around the room. It was a moment filled with emotion and tears for both of them, celebrating an important milestone. Over time, Helen became more independent, walking around the house and yard without needing help. Stephen still accompanied her to therapy, but Helen was already doing a lot of things on her own. One day, while they were having tea, Helen told Stephen that she wanted to live alone. Stephen was surprised by the sudden declaration. "You're still recovering and you need support," he argued. But Helen was determined. "I need to try to live for myself. Now that I can, I don't want to always depend on you." Helen was determined to gain autonomy and no longer see herself as a burden, expressing her desire to begin a new phase of independence. Stephen gently held Helen's hand, looking into her eyes with a mixture of fatherly love and admiration. "Helen, you have never been and will never be a burden to me. I am here to support you for as long as you need. But if you feel like you are ready to follow your own path, I want you to know that you have my full support." "I'm incredibly proud of you," Stephen said, his voice cracking with emotion. They hugged, a hug filled with unconditional love and support. Stephen felt a mixture of pride in Helen's determination and a pang of sadness at the prospect of seeing her go, after years of struggles and achievements together. The idea of not sharing everyday life weighed heavily on his heart, but he understood that it was essential to allow Helen to follow her own path and live her life fully. Over the years, Helen really turned into a free bird, as Stephen used to say. She found someone special, got engaged and was building her own story, full of love and independence. One particularly quiet night, Stephen had a vivid dream about his now-deceased wife. In the dream, she hugged him tenderly, smiling with that look full of gratitude and love that he remembered so well. She thanked him for everything he had done, expressing her pride in Stephen's strength and dedication as a father. This dream brought Stephen a sense of peace and closure. It was as if he had somehow received the approval he had always sought, a sign that, despite the challenges and uncertainties, he had followed the right path by raising Helen with so much love and dedication. If this story touched your heart, I ask you to leave a like, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to leave your opinion on what you thought of the story below.